This is a reading from Nevermind Yar by K. Mathur. To give you a bit of background, Shalini, the main protagonist, is visiting her dadi in Jaipur. She's confused and needs to sort things out in her mind. Her life was all planned for her. She was to have an arranged marriage, a partner handpicked by her family, who she would then fall in love with. Bhagu was definitely not part of that plan. In Jaipur, she comes upon her dadi telling a story to her young cousins. Shalini listens to the folklore of her ancestors, and it brings back memories of her own childhood, which was a happy one. She begins to feel secure and comforted. Mumbai is just a distant memory. And now, Dadi's story. Bhabuti the Barber. Once there was a king. He was mighty and powerful, but at the same time he ruled his kingdom with justice. He had a great secret. Nobody knew this. The king had only one ear. The other ear was missing. The king always kept it covered with magnificent safas, turbans. It had been easy to keep his secret for all these years, but now the king needed a haircut. He was in a quandary, for the barber would surely discover his missing ear. He sent for Bhabhuti. Bhabhuti was pleased. To cut the royal tresses was indeed an honor. He presented himself at the royal palace in his best dhoti and armed with his sharpest scissors. As he trimmed away at the royal locks, he was full of praise for their magnificence and shine. Suddenly, Bhabhuti went silent. His hand hesitated, and then stilled. He looked closely, and then looked again. The king had a missing ear. Bhabuti was utterly surprised. He stared at the king through the mirror, his mouth and eyes wide. The king looked back at him solemnly. Then he turned around to face Bhabuti, and in a stern voice swore him to secrecy. What you just saw, Bhabuti, is for only you to know. Never tell any other person, not even your own wife. Then he added in a menacing voice, if ever word of my missing ear gets out, you will be severely punished. Bhabuti trembled with fear and swore to the king that he would never breathe a word to a single person. Then he was sent away. But on his way home, he thought and thought about the king's missing ear and desperately wanted to tell someone. He thought he might burst if he didn't share his secret. So he went deep into the woods, looked around, and spotted a tall tree. He thrust his face through a hole in the tree and whispered his secret. He whispered good and long and hard. Then he laughed and laughed and went back home. A few days later, some woodcutters chopped down the same tree. They sold it to a man who made musical instruments for a living. This man made a harmonium, a sitar, a violin, and tablas from the trunk, and sold the instruments to the court musicians. The king was a patron of the arts, and invited his entire kingdom to come and listen to the fine new instruments of his court musicians. When everyone was seated, the musicians got ready to tune their brand new instruments. Everyone felt silent. Suddenly, the tablaz went damak. The tablawala was surprised because he had not even touched the instrument. The violin sprang to life, making the violin player recoil in fright. It wailed on a thin note. Rajajiro Khan, the king has one ear. The harmonium sang. Thane koon kayo? Who told you? The tabla boomed back. Bhabuti nai kayo. And with a great cacophony of sound, all the musical instruments laughed and laughed. The entire gathering was thunderstruck, not least the king. He was very angry and sent for Bhabuti Nai. A very frightened Bhabuti Nai was brought before the king. He told the king how he had whispered the secret only to a tree deep in the woods and to no one else. The king realized that the musical instruments must have been made from the same tree. Bhabuti Nai had indeed kept his promise. He hadn't told any person. The musical instruments were still laughing. The king found their laughter so infectious that he suddenly joined in. All his subjects were relieved, for they were holding themselves back with great difficulty. And everyone laughed, and laughed, and laughed.